session is being recorded, just a reminder of that, and we'll post that when it's done in the Schedule site. Welcome to Demystifying the Service Delivery Plan, Part 1. This is a two-part confidence builder. And so we have Carl and David here to help us navigate through the service delivery plan and share their knowledge with us. So thanks, everyone.
All right, well, welcome. Dave and I are going to be trading off over the course of the day here. Both of us have done many a service delivery plan. One of the things we'll highlight over the course of this presentation is a number of the changes. There have been more than 25 new changes or adjustments to the service delivery plan in the last few months, some of them directly adjusting for the COVID situation, some of them just incremental improvements to the plan to make it easier to use. So we'll cover those. In the first announcements of this class, we did talk about it as a beginning and an advanced. And that's not really where we settled on. What we settled on is more of a discussion of why do the plan and then how to do the plan. So we'll follow through on that over the course of the evening here. So first, the housekeeping. And if you've seen my presentations before, you've seen this many times, and you are all experts by now. Unmute, video on when speaking or not is up to you. Raising your hand, a new feature added recently. If you have hearing limitations, the closed captioning is a really nice feature, and you can turn it on using the three-dot menu in the middle. Courtesy to others, when you do speak up, we like raising the hand because then we don't talk over each other. Since you can't see each other, that's pretty common. You all got that? And let's keep moving. So purpose here, understanding what the service delivery plan is, how it's created, and how it's used. So those are the basic things here, and then we're going to practice doing it. So this is a hands-on virtual class, and hopefully you'll get some experience on the background. Any questions on the purpose and the way we've structured it so far? Okay. So topics today is all about the what. What is the plan and how is it used is the first part here. Inputs needed to build the plan. Certainly it helps to have the data ready when you start putting your plan together. And then what are some of the things that move the needle in terms of the plan and change the budget, for example. Tomorrow we'll actually go through the demonstration of filling out the plan, talk about different approaches you could use on a DR. The approval process, and when to update it. One of the things we'd like to do, and I don't know how quickly I can do this, but we'll give it a try, is how many of you have ever done a plan? I'm going to put a quick survey up here so you can take a look at that. Poll. And so just a simple yes or no. And have you ever worked on a plan? And if I made this harder. Okay, I see most people coming in with a number of yeses and nos. So great. Okay, and then who has, well, so you've worked on plans before, a lot of you have. Those who have said, well, we'll cover more of that later. So that's good, we've got a nice mix. Please feel free to ask questions along the way. I recognize a lot of the names as they're going by, so I know I've worked on plans with you already. Okay, what is a plan? And a lot of people think the plan is a budget. Well, it turns out the budget is part of it, but it's not the real purpose of the plan. The real purpose of the plan is a summary or overview of all of the services you plan to provide and how many weeks you're going to be providing them. So give you a general overview of what lays ahead for the operation. It outlines the staffing that will be needed. And certainly one of the big questions that comes up in doing a service delivery plan is how fast you need to staff up. And we covered some of that with the mass care planning tool a couple weeks ago. We can go into greater detail that in force packages and so forth if you have questions, but we'll cover that. Some of the resources to be provided, and I've mentioned mass care already, sheltering, feeding, the distribution of emergency services, reunification services. Turns out reunification services is a very small staff typically, but it's certainly a service that's provided in mass care. The recovery, are you going to be using DCA or immediate assistance? That's a decision that gets made fairly early on. We'll talk about that. How the individual disaster care units are going to be, activities are going to be supplying and supporting the operation. And then what about the support services such as logistics? How is that going to be staffed? How is it going to be set up? Where are you going to warehouse materials? Are you going to be supplying the staff locally or from need to recruit across the nation to provide that? One of the outcomes of the plan, and this is really quite critical and a lot of people miss, is that there is no magic pot of gold to support disaster relief operations sitting at national headquarters. There's certainly funds there for emergencies, but most of our disaster responses, fundraising is done based on the expected budget for the operation. So it's really important to get a budget out there and get that to the fundraisers so that they have a goal as far as how much money needs to be raised to support the given operations to keep the Red Cross in good fiscal health. So that's one of the purposes that's used for the initial planning tool and also for the service delivery plan itself. Hopefully you've all seen this plan. I'm not sure who wanted to take control there. Oops.
Unmute works.
Okay, we'll be back in a second.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is your slide, Dave, so take it away.
All right. Do I hit take control here?
Yes, please.
All right. We're going to go through basically showing out, as Carl said, one of the goals is to take a look. A service delivery plan should end up as our plan for moving forward through the breadth of the entire disaster. As such, we do go through several stages. Most of you have been through this before. We have the initiation stage. This is when we're trying to bring as much as we can into the operation to get it up and going. We set up the shelters. We may lean forward as far as possible, bringing in more than we will need. Next phase is the stabilization of if you set up a lot of evacuation shelters. The next day they say, hey, a bunch of folks can go home. You start going down and we stabilize. We come to what are we actually going to need to continue this operation. We go into sustainment. Very often, one of the words used with that is we go in, we sustain for a while, but we also enter the recovery phase where we start to provide assistance, immediate assistance to clients, and then into demobilization. Demobilization is basically saying we're down to, we've met the needs of 95% of our clients. Our shelters are down to 1 or 2. It looks like we can pretty well close down this operation, put all the books in a box and carry them into the regional office, which is the goal. So we demobilize. And it does give an idea, at least here, of where, when we are setting up the plan and working with it, we do look at weeks involved in it. And actually for the first couple weeks, what is the effort going to be? How many people will we be feeding? How many people will we have in shelters overnight? And then we base our plan on that. go a little bit further into that while we're doing it. There's homework to be done. In the initial phases, we do develop the advanced operation plan. We will put out an IIR very, very early in the process, within 2 hours. And we will go ahead and then develop the service delivery plan of looking at, and we basically taking a look at from the beginning of the stabilization phase and moving on through. We have a couple days, we can get that out of the way. Very beginning, and we are going to take a very brief look at the IIR and other things we have. Where do we get our information from? Where are we? What are we basing our assumptions upon? In California, you've got Cal Fire. Up in Alaska, I'm going to the Bureau of Land Management fire page, and I'm looking up and seeing just how big is this fire, how is it spreading, what type of resources are there. Very often, this type of information will be online within those first 2 hours. The other is to watch your local news channels and pull up any reports you might need. But to get an idea of how many people are affected and what's happening, trying to get as close to what the actual situation is. There is going to be speculation at the very beginning. There's not a heck of a lot of ways around it because you are going to get several sources. Within that first 2 hours, and this is one thing I advise and try to get my folks up here to do, is everybody should have a template for an IIR on their desktop. Who's ever going to be running the operation or who's ever responding has a lot going through their head at the time that that's going on. They need somebody to pull up that IIR, and actually I do phone interviews with people as they're driving to the sites. We are looking at, it's pretty standard stuff, the region, division, what is the incident, who called it in, or how did you learn of it? Are we on the scene? When were we notified? I have no shame in going to the fire service and grabbing their description of the disaster and doing a cut and paste so that I've got a summary of what is going on with that disaster, and then put in how the Red Cross is responding. You may or may not know at the very beginning, but planning, are we going to go over to that $10,000 range? Are we going, is this something, and I'll use the case of a fire, are we going into a large subdivision and it looks like it's going to have a major effect on it? Do we have a hot day, a lot of wind, and a lot of embers flying? The trend of the event is basically where are we in the process of it? Is it growing? Has it stopped? Are we coming in after the action? And then what is our trigger for the IIR? Those are listed later on in the report, but a common trigger is there is a death, there's a lot of media, there are injured Red Cross people, there's a Red Cross facility hurt, you feel it's going to go over $10,000. Any one of those is a trigger. Estimated number of residences affected, that may be difficult to pull very early. You do not have to put it in there, but if you've got an idea or it's an area you've worked in, you can put in a conjecture at this point. Estimated number of individuals, again, you probably won't have how many are affected. You may get a report in one of those fire things saying that they are evacuating X number of structures. They never say homes. X number of structures affected, and they are evacuating X number of people. And you can put that in and explain any impacts that may be on service delivery, whether you can get into that area, whether you're going to have to look at something that is outside of the normal service area, and you may actually be going into another chapter or region with what you're doing. Service delivery, just putting in again, are you going to shelter, feed? Will health services be needed? Spiritual care, caseworker, distribution of supplies. That's all conjecture. Go on your best gut feeling. Have discussions with people who have experience in that area. Try to get as much information as you can, but you do try to get it out within that 2-hour time period. Other factors that may cause more, it's a slow news day. The media's all over it. Put in your safety concerns and then weather concerns that may go. And then any additional comments, get it out in 2 hours. That's your first report. Your second, if it looks like, and this is more of a case in Alaska, if I've got to move people around the state, I may need to fly them. I need to put in at least an incident so that I can work with staff services and get them on an airplane. Does it look like it's going to go over $10,000? Are we going to be requesting a DR in this process? And then it does provide an immediate means to start the 5266 process. So you don't come back 3 days later begging people for 6409s and receipts. Start the process early. How many involved? Who's working on it? Takes a few more minutes to put in an incident, but it does make life easier as you go through. Assessment, immediate assessment, disaster assessment of what has happened. Immediate is extend boundaries of the disaster. I think I'll use the fire again as the best example of this. You're going to be getting conjectures on how many acres are involved, where is the area that it is involved. You can get ideas of how many neighborhoods have been cleared out, and you get an idea of what the boundaries are. You also get the wonderful word, it's like no containment up to when the fire itself is contained. PDA can come from several sources. Very early, it's going to be coming from your responders or the responding parties, whoever they are. We'll be working with talking to them, trying to find out what it is, but this is only our preliminary. We're trying to get a very good idea of what's affected and what's going on. Area assessment is something that is probably not going to occur until we're close to doing a fairly good job of getting a count on how many actually are affected and homes are affected. And then we get to use that wonderful thing called the polygon that says we don't have to go doing a lot of detail on anything within the bounds of that area. It may not be the entire impact area, but it does allow for casework and things to occur a little bit differently later on. Detailed damage assessment is when we finally can go in and get a good idea of how many homes are fully affected. For small disasters, for a level 2 or a small level 3, there are times that you can get a fairly good idea of what the numbers are going to be as you go into this. But when you're working with an IIR, or when you start working with your SDA and your initial reports, you're not going to have all of this information. You just do the best you can to come up with what you can. Yeah.
All right.
And
Thank you, David. Not a problem. Okay, so what I want to do is we're going through a lot of the initial documents that are done in a DR, and we don't want to really duplicate some of the things you heard if you participated in the talk yesterday on the first 72 hours. But what we're trying to emphasize here is a lot of the information you need to fill out the initial the initial planning tool is already in your hands. It comes from these initial reports that are being created, and if you gather that information, you'll have most of what you need to complete the IPT and much of what will later be added to the service delivery plan. So that's why we're focusing on these reports here, to recognize that the data you will need at the end of today's talk you have already seen in reports that were generated either by you or others on the operation before you need to fulfill and complete the plan. So the next one in that line of documents is the advanced operational plan. And that's something we gave a talk on a couple weeks ago on the advanced operational plan. The first tool for the advanced operational plan is called the Mass Care Planning Tool. And you can listen to the recording of that talk that was done a couple weeks ago, as I mentioned. You can download the tool and also the companion documents. There is a new version of the tool which is being released later this month. So right now you'll see the earlier version online and the earlier training, but again, that'll be updated soon. The key thing there is it can give you a description of what and where is the need. Based on the scale of that need, what level of service and provided when by the Red Cross are some of the things you put into the advanced operational plan. What amount of Red Cross resources can be made available within the required time frame? And this is a question really of, are the resources available? So the planning tools will tell you what you need, and then you'll have to work with others to find out whether you can get that. If you need 1,000 people today, it's very unlikely you're going to get 1,000 people. But if you need 1,000 people in 3 days, if there's not another major disaster nationwide, we can probably work to get that sort of resource to you. So that becomes a discussion with headquarters and discussion with other groups as far as this item here of what resources you need and can they be available to you in the time frame that your planning indicates. Also, what additional resources from government and partners you may want to request. In many cases, our partners will have resources that can supplement the Red Crosses. In some cases, we will be supplementing the resources our government partners have. So that goes both ways. And to what level of service has the Red Cross committed to and by when? And this is usually a commitment to our government partners, but it could be to other partners that we have, or even a commitment to ourselves. Because as we've said, our mission hasn't changed in the era of COVID. just the way we execute and complete that mission. And sometimes it's more difficult. And so can we deliver to the scale that we as an organization wish to? So this is what an operational plan looks like out of the new tool. And again, Kirsten published the link in the chat to the talk where we covered this, and there'll be more coming on the operational plan. The training for the operational plan is scheduled to be released toward the end of this month. And then we'll have much more information in that direction. Any questions at this point? Okay, hearing none. What's the timing of the service delivery plan? There are a couple of different steps here. The initial planning tool is done within the first 48 hours. Then you'll be updating the initial planning tool as you get more information. One thing that I always remember is in the first few hours of disaster, only about 50% of the information is correct. The classic example I have in my area is we sent ambulances to a plane crash in San Bruno. Turned out there was a pipeline explosion and not an airplane crash. Did they need the ambulances? Absolutely. Did they need support? Absolutely. Did it really matter that it was different? Not tremendously. I mean, the resources needed to be there and they needed to sort it out. So we are an organization and we are in an area of disaster response where we respond and we adjust as we go along. And so that's a large part of what you're doing between the initial incident report, which is just to give a heads up to people of what is happening, through the initial planning tool where you're getting it more refined, you're starting to get the scale, to the service delivery plan where you have a pretty good idea of what's being done. The service delivery plan for a large operation is done around day 6. When I'm in a mass care role, I often refer to that as the easy out in the service delivery plan, because usually by day 6 you have 90% of your shelters are open, your feeding plan is at fully operational, and so you've got a pretty good feel for what your service delivery will be in mass care. Other groups, such as recovery, hasn't even requested their caseworkers yet, and or decided necessarily whether it'll be individual assistance or DCA, because those things haven't begun yet on a large operation on day 6. So it really depends on the activity of what level of confidence you have in the information as you're filling in the service delivery plan. And then updating the plan, and this is after day 6. Well, you know, significant changes could occur on day 7, hopefully not. Hopefully your crystal ball is a little sharper than that, and the changes may be coming down in week 14 or somewhere later on, but they do occur. Certainly the one where we're in wildfire season, somehow or another wildfires do break containment. They do go different directions than expected. And so we need to adjust the plans if they change from what we expected. And let's face it, sometimes we just make mistakes. We thought we had enough people locally to staff the operation, and it turns out we're going to have to, instead of flying in 20% of the staff, we'd have to fly in 50% of the staff. Now, in this time of COVID, that's not to worry, since 70% of the people are deployed to operations remotely. So very few people are flying, but in general, you can see areas where something wasn't anticipated and you need to adjust the plan because of that. Okay. Now we're getting into the cost drivers, and this was one of the questions mentioned earlier, and we'll cover a little bit about how do you figure out the $10,000 to know whether you're at a level 2 operation. But staffing has generally been one of the biggest expenses. It ranges between 25 and 50% of the costs on the operations, and we'll show you some numbers in a little while or tomorrow, depending on time. So that's a big part. Right now with COVID, we've shifted from only 5 to 10% of staff being remote to 70% of staff being remote. So staff travel costs and staff deployment costs are no longer a major expense in our current environment. However, the other costs have changed. Mass care is generally the largest cost of an operation, especially in the first weeks. North of 40% of the staff on an operation in the first week is often in mass care. So they are a big part of that. If you're putting people into hotel rooms instead of into a congregate shelter, that's a much higher cost to the Red Cross. And so it changes things dramatically. If you wanted to estimate the cost of an operation to find out if you're going to be passing the $10,000 level, an easy one is the cost of a hotel room. And let's just be simple. If it were $50 and you're doing 20 people, you've got $1,000 right there. If it's for 10 days, you'd have $10,000 right in sheltering alone. But you're also going to be providing meals. You're going to be providing other resources. So it's straightforward to get a rough estimate of the costs based on the number of people involved in the case you're using hotel rooms. The same thing is you have to add in costs for rental cars. You have to add in costs for other things that you will use on an operation. It's pretty straightforward to normally see that you're going to pass the $10,000 level. Passing the $50,000 level to get to a level 3 gets to be more complicated, understanding how many people are deployed, what sort of services you're providing. But the tool can help you get there. And as we said, you start doing the tool at a level 2, so you can get there quickly, and it will help you figure out what level of operation you are at. Just use it and start filling in the blanks. Number of people provided with financial assistance, and what's the average case size? That's pretty straightforward to come up with and gives you another metric of what you're doing. Casework or financial assistance ranges wildly on operations. I've seen it as low as a few percent, and I've seen it over 50% of the operation is financial assistance. If you think about a mass casualty event, for example, where we have very little sheltering and very little feeding, and a large part of what we do may be financial assistance. So it could vary widely as far as the type of event. For transportation, it's going to be very different as well, because in that case, the transportation organization usually pays a good chunk of the costs, and our costs are mainly around staff supporting them. So again, it's not straightforward to say what's the key driver, because it depends entirely on the type of operation that you're supporting. What will the partners cover? World Central Kitchen has been great in that they often provide all the meals for the operation on their own fundraising. Salvation Army does that to a large degree as well. On the other hand, if we use this, they provide all the labor and the equipment to make the meals, but we provide all of the food that they cook. So in that case, it's a fairly even mix of costs, and it's easy to run up fairly large costs. I have noticed in some of the past DRs that we do provide some financial support to other organizations such as World Central Kitchen or Salvation Army, depending on what arrangements that have been made between the DR and the local organization. So be aware of that, and because your costs could change radically when that comes into play. One of the questions that came up in the chat, which I can address now, is Mass Care Planning Tool. It was designed for steady state, although I covered it in the talk. You can make adjustments to it to cover the cost you have during the COVID environment. So there are some buttons and some levers you can play in the Mass Care Planning Tool to cover that. Okay, data-driven decision making. A lot of people, when we previewed the slides, they said, what the heck is that? The biggest thing that I can describe there is when we're out in the field doing an operation, every county that we serve will come back with needs, or in many cases. Sometimes those needs are actually aligned with our disaster assessment, and sometimes those needs are not. What we try and do is work with our government partners to make sure that the disaster assessment that we're providing resources for matches with what the government agencies are requesting. And there have been many cases where we provided far more resources to one county, even though it had lower damage than another county with higher damage. And we want to get better at using our tools so we better match the need and the services provided. Okay. Some of the adjustments for the COVID era, I've already mentioned. Non-congregate shelters, hotels, are now one of our top cost factors in this operations where hotels are used. They quickly overcome, and the operations are slightly higher cost for the same level of people displaced. So instead of having our staff fly out, we're providing hotels to the people displaced. The inclusion of PPE, I haven't found record of the PPE charges, but I'm going to research that as far as what a DR gets billed for the PPE that's being supplied by National. Of course, if you order your own PPE locally, PPE is personal protective equipment, the masks and gowns, then you would certainly put that on a P card or other purchasing locally. The other big change is the rental car occupancy ratio has gone way down. To keep the distance between people, the maximum number of people we're requesting in a Red Cross car is 2. And in many cases, it's now 1 person per car. Now, it's mirrored with the fact that far fewer people in the field, so there aren't as much of a need for cars, but the ratio has been relaxed to be a much lower number. Any questions on the cost drivers? This is sort of an important part to think about when you're preparing your plan. And I know a couple of questions came up earlier on that. I see a comment in the chat on, well, I'll cover you, Carmela, in just a minute here. So a comment on the chat about vans. And vans in the COVID era are not quite clear whether you can get the distancing and it's confined space. So I'm not sure how that's going to work. That's something we should certainly discuss. But vans are certainly a useful one when you can combine people and reduce the number of total rentals. Even if the van is twice as much as an individual car, you can often get more than that in terms of value. Okay, Carmela, why don't we take your question?
Yeah, for the partner relationship, supposing we can rely, well, we usually approach a company for snacks and sanitizers and that kind of thing. Do we just plug in the expense anyway in the cost driver just in case they can't supply the amount we need or can't supply us, period?
Well, so it turns out that from a cost standpoint, in-kind donations count as money received by the operation and then spent by the operation. So if an in-kind donation is something you would have used, you would have purchased on the operation. So even though you receive it free, it needs to be counted. So in the case of snacks, if you were going to supply snacks, you need to record that money in there. Another example of something that wouldn't be covered is we don't normally pay for rentals of our shelters. So for example, in-kind shelters, congregate care shelters. If we needed to rent a space, then that would be an additional cost that would need to be put in the budget. Does that answer your question?
I want to go into that a little bit more, Carla. You're
Sure.
Totally right. On the IKD and why we budget for it, though, you know, when you're early on the relief operation, we don't know what we're going to be able to get through in-kind or not. And so, like Carl said, we have to assume we're going to have to make a commitment for it, so we budget for it. And then when we do 5266 reporting, like Carl said, we record it as a commitment regardless. And then sometimes we're able to not pay cash for it, if you will, because we were able to secure that IKD. So, but regardless, we got to capture it as a commitment and a projected commitment on the service delivery plan.
Right, and one of the things a lot of people trip on is in-kind donations versus unsolicited donations, or unsolicited donation management, UDM. If you were going to pay for it and use it for the operation, it counts as IKD, in-kind donation. If it's an optional item that you may not use, then it would usually be in the class of unsolicited donations. So it gets very complicated sometimes to think about the individual item and which way it would go. But if you were going to pay for it, it's generally classed as an in-kind donation. All right, good. Thank you, Chris. Next thing is, this is in your ConOps, and most people listening to this presentation have probably seen ConOps before, but it's worth remembering what levels of expenses, and the part that gets missed a lot is what level of transaction. Because if you think about it here in a level 3 operation, which is what a lot of you in the division level training we're doing here would be working in. So even though the budget might be up to 250,000, any individual transaction approved by the DD, the division disaster director, did I get that right, Chris? Is limited to less than 25,000. So the per transaction charge is often far less than the budget. In this case, you can see it's 10% for that level 3 operation for the DDD. If it's the division disaster executive, in our case, Denise, she could certainly approve a purchase that would be up to the full budget of the operation. But it's important to think about which level of transaction approval versus total budget of the operation. And there are different approval levels for people on the operation. It's not necessarily, again, something that's baked into the plan, and your operational plan, your service delivery plan is going to be what it needs to be to provide the services of the clients, but it's to understand where the operational controls are going to be and who approves the plan is the purpose of this slide. So if you're level 1 or 2, your region approves it, your RDO or your regional executive. If you're a division level operation, so that's up to 2.5 million, it can be approved by the division vice president. And if it's other ones, they're going to be national operations and have their own budgets and approvals. You do notice that the approvals for the actual response involves the VP of Disaster Operations and Logistics, Brad Kaiserman at this point. We'll be working with you on those. So it's important to know the levels of approval. Certainly I've tripped in certain operations, and I've signed a 6409 for things I clearly didn't have the signature or authority to do. So the good news is there is processing in the background that will take care of getting those approvals if you follow the process. Okay. And I think oh, it's still mine. Okay, so the service delivery methods drive the plan. So how are you going to do sheltering? Is it going to be congregate, non-congregate? Are you going to use a few large shelters or lots of small shelters? And that'll depend on the geography of the disaster and the incidence of COVID in the area, for example. The individual disaster care, we've got slides coming up on each of these, so I'm only going to cover them overview here. The feeding, the distribution of emergency supplies. Notice all 4 of these first ones, the mass care planning tool will generate estimates for you of the number of people needed and the resources needed for all 4 of these items. The recovery area and the disaster client assistance will be additional areas you'll need to plan on, and then logistics. So now let's go into more detail on each of these. Well, sheltering, congregate versus non-congregate is the biggest one here. Congregate shelter, you can cover a lot of people very quickly with very efficiently in terms of staff. It's what we do the most of for the Red Cross in normal times. The con, it's very difficult in the current environment to do congregate sheltering and keep the spacing and the reduce the transmission. It's not nearly as nice of a client experience, certainly. Non-congregate, it's very comfortable in comparison. Certainly all of us have enjoyed being in a hotel rather than a staff shelter, but it's far more expensive for the organization. So that's going to be your first choice. We do have guidance right now, which is this flow chart that's in the COVID compendium of what our preferences is. The first is if hotel rooms or dorm rooms are available, we're going to go with non-congregate. It does have a recommendation for campgrounds, but I haven't not seen a lot of guidance on how to do that yet. Some of our regions have been successful. And then we'll do the congregate sheltering. We're going to try and do small shelters in general. So you're going to have a lot more sites if we succeed in doing less than 50 people, because often, certainly in wildfire hurricanes, we have many larger shelters, initially at least. And some of the wildfire guidance where we have to move very quickly and have tens of thousands of people evacuated, the only solution may be large shelters initially. Yes, Belinda.
I noticed a note in the corner of your previous, in slide 18, which mentioned shower trailers.
Oh, right. Thank you for noticing that. One of the things that I'm sort of on a tear on is that people, when they select a congregate shelter site, aren't taking into account, especially for post-impact, whether there are showers in the facility or not. And shower trailers cost us roughly in the range of $8,000 per week to have those showers. So if you don't have showers in a shelter site, we're going to be bringing in a trailer. And certainly one of our sites we had last year, we had 2 shower trailers because we had a shower trailer for ADA compliance and we had a second shower trailer for general use. So we were spending north of $15,000 a week for shower trailers for that one site. Had we found a similar shelter that happened to have showers in it, we would have saved the Red Cross considerable funds on that operation. So shelter sites and ADA compliance are key things for a congregate shelter that are big cost drivers that a lot of people don't recognize. And we're certainly working to try and make that data more readily available. It's in NSS, but it's not top level, so you can sort on it quickly, which is something we're working toward having. Thank you, Belinda. That was a good comment. Okay. Individual disaster care. Oh, sorry, I skipped feeding. Oh, right, it comes. Individual disaster care, the question there is, this is health services, mental health services, spiritual care are all in this group. Are they going to be on-site services, which are great, high visibility, fast response to a client that's in need? Sometimes we have limitations on availability of staff. Do you have enough disaster health workers or mental health workers, spiritual care workers in that area in order to staff those sites? Or are you going to need to work with remote workers or itinerating workers where they go between sites? So those are different modalities of delivering the services to the individual sites. All of them work. Each has advantages and disadvantages as reflected here. I don't know how much we're doing itinerating. I saw some people in disaster health services on the list of participants. If somebody can speak to that. Are you doing itinerating now? I suspect not in the COVID era.
Actually, we are.
You are.
If we do multiple congregate shelters, then we have an itinerating manager.
Okay, but not the general workers.
Not the general workers, but we do have the on-site workers, and then we do have an itinerating manager, which is not that uncommon anytime, COVID or not, when we have multiple shelters.
Okay, and perhaps they will enter, perhaps they won't, the individual sites, I guess.
They will go inside.
They will. Okay, thank you, Diane. So that is the question there. And then, of course, there's the remote, and we often are in the position of doing remote services. And certainly I've seen it with some of the services where it's on-site during the day, but maybe off-site after hours. So there could be hybrids as well. The feeding, what's your fixed feeding plan? And one of the things that came out when I did the budget analysis here is I have not found an operation where sheltering costs and DES together was more than the total cost of feeding. So feeding turns out to be one of our biggest cost items on an operation. One of the big reasons there, of course, is we generally get our shelter facilities for free We borrow them from our partners, so it's really a staff cost which goes in a different budget item. But feeding is a substantial cost. If you think about a meal at $4 average, and you start doing 10,000 of them a day, you can add up costs very quickly for the operation. It's not uncommon to have feeding bills that go into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Are you going to do fixed feeding, mobile feeding? In the case of mobile feeding, you're going to need to have herbs to provide to move the meals around and deliver them. In most cases, are you going to be using catering or in-kind feeding? So lots of different options that you might do to support the clients that are affected. So all of them work. To develop your service delivery plan, you just need to make some decisions. What's best for the clients in the affected area that you're working? And then the last one in the mass care area, I didn't put reunification in here because it turns out not to be a big cost driver, not because it's not important to mass care. So for those of you in reunification, you are not forgotten. You're just very cost efficient, let's call it that. For distribution of emergency supplies, it's somewhat the same decisions as we had in the previous one. Are you doing mobile distribution, in which case you need more vehicles? You can get the materials directly to people. Are you using points of distribution, probably requiring fewer vehicles, but you bring people together? Are you doing targeted or direct distribution? This is something we do more in islands or remote areas. For example, you've been through some of our previous trainings, and you talk about the areas where you can't buy enough mattresses locally, so we as the Red Cross will buy them and ship them in and provide direct distribution of some of the items. So again, all of the methods work. What you need to look at and think about is what's best for the clients impacted by the particular event that you're supporting. David, back to you. Oh, you're on mute, David.
That's probably better that way.
We love your voice. Now, come on.
In recovery, we are basically looking at two phases of it now. In our response phase, we are looking at shelter resident transition. This will probably be a summer with some confusion as to where we are tracking our recovery. In CAS, we will be working with shelter resident transition. In most cases, this will be done with a remote or virtual caseworker working with about 8 families. And we are looking at up to $300 per family to help them meet their recovery needs so that they can move on out of the shelter and move on. This does not mean that they will not receive assistance from other sources, but to get them out of the shelter, and in the response stage, we have the shelter resident transition. Recovery itself, for a level 3 and below, we will do direct client assistance that provides immediate B, which is the $125 per person, plus supplemental, and that comes from the CAS system. Level 4 and above, and I will back up and say there will be times where it can get to a higher level 3. There will be discussions about whether to move it into what's called immediate assistance. Immediate assistance is level 4 and above, and that comes through at about $450 per family. That is accessed by the clients themselves. The families can go online, go to redcross.org, get directed to that DR, and then go in and put in their information if they feel that their homes are major or destroyed. If we have information either from FEMA or others from shelters, wherever, that gives us a mobile phone number or an email, we can contact those clients. That comes out of a national headquarters of immediate assistance. It is not CAS. For island responses, for those in Pacific Islands and others, we can look at going towards using DCA, direct client assistance, again, primarily because of change in time zones, expense of communications, and the geography involved in the situation. But there will be this summer 2 very distinct uses, and that'll be individual assistance and CAS, and you can have clients receiving assistance from both as we go forward. Delivery of it, we can look back at the setting up service centers. Most of you are familiar with that, and that's where we announce a day, a location, and we basically set up and have people come through. In this case, it will probably be very discouraged. We will be doing a lot because of COVID. We will be doing more of trying to get information on the clients, working with them with virtual caseworkers and calling them. If on a later disaster outside of this, we do end up with very long lines, and it's not exactly the best client experience. There are pop-up centers. If we are working with individual assistance, or we are working with anything that has the client go online and sign up for the program, there are populations that either don't have access to the computers, the tablets that are needed to put in their information. We can train and do train people to become coaches, not caseworkers, that can go into an area and then coach clients as they go through entering their information that is needed for assistance. The con on this one is it does require additional DST support, and we do have to train the coaches. I have seen where we do work more with EBVs. We're not looking at the full range of training a caseworker as much as we're working with somebody in a senior center, or of helping them through entering data onto a tablet. Outreach is normally to targeted areas. Very often it is what we would call even a hot shot. We are sending people out to an area. They are taking a look at the property. They are determining whether that property is major or destroyed. And then they go ahead and open a case and provide assistance on the spot. It does require vehicles. Again, the preferred is going to try to identify the client and then reach them in a virtual manner. Online is going to be much more common, especially level 4 and above. Again, that's where we are looking at individual assistance. We are encouraging clients or potential clients to go online, put in their information, and then we'll try to come back and meet their needs. And it is coordinated through national headquarters. As I said, this will be a summer, past couple summers actually, there has been some confusion of going between these, the CAS and the individual assistants. There is a new call center set up. Things are much smoother now, and we will be transitioning to RC Cares. Right now I'm hearing a November date, which does have one system that allows the flexibility to address most of this moving forward. Contingency planning. Basically, when we do go ahead and we are looking at this, what do we have to start looking at? What happens when stuff goes wrong? And to take the time to sit down, in active evacuations, are we going to be moving shelters? Look at some of the larger California fires recently where you're closing a shelter and you're moving further away. Are we looking at more storms coming in? Are we looking at more areas affected? Do we have to open up more facilities? How do we plan on that? And do we have a plan in place to go back and revisit the service delivery plan and perhaps move up the cost of that? Especially, there is a brief time in the very beginning when we're doing our initial planning that you've got some time for adjustment, but be aware that there will be needs for contingency plans and go through and up your cost if you need to. COOP planning in this case, we are looking at more of, are you moving your headquarters? What do we have to do if we have to move our operation? What plans do we have in place for backups to move out of where we are now into another place without losing much continuity as we're going through? Demobilization, be prepared for it. And my most recent one with that was working Florence and having Michael knocking on the door. And suddenly we end up in what we call the glide path very quickly, where you are looking at shelter closings. What alternatives do we have for clients? Normally not within 24 hours, but you can lose staff and an ability to support your presence on the ground within 3-4 days. It's not that terribly unusual. Workforce, force packages pretty much set up. EBVs, you're going to see in all of this, especially now in the time of COVID, where you have a need to have people on the ground. Who can we use from the local area? You're going to, at least through this summer and actually into our fall, we're going to have quite a bit of virtual work with clients. How do we start looking at and addressing the use of EBVs across the board? Strike teams, compact, go in, remote workers, deployed workers, and local existing workers, all bringing on, trying to, we do have in the COVID directories and the compendium, we do have a picture of what workers will normally be deployed into a disaster. You're looking at about 5 going into a shelter, and and then who's going to be working from outside, and then as much as possible, without burning them out, local existing workers. Materials, disaster, are we going to set up a center of where we do bring in supplies? Do we purchase locally? Had a brief discussion on this one while we're going through this. If you're in Alaska, we are looking at shipping costs of islands, other areas. What can we buy locally that's going to keep down our costs for our DES in-kind donations? I think we've talked about that a bit. That is part of your budget. We don't know exactly what's coming in. We do acknowledge them, but they are taken off that budget that we are developing it. We don't plan on in-kind as we go into the development. Of unsolicited donations, and I think Carl touched on that one a bit, that it may be stuff that you want and can hand out to people, and can be things that can actually be used right now during this period of COVID. The clothing and other unsolicited donations that show up in our shelters, we will be turning down or asking them to go out for assistance. What are prox accounts of, Carl?
I think, well, I think that's referring to the accounts that we have with a number of suppliers.
Okay.
Where, so like the FedEx account or some of the other accounts where we can purchase. I know we have one with Home Depot as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say then, I've used in the past Lowe's, Home Depot, where we do have national accounts, and we do look them up. It does take some coordination, but they do make it possible to do local purchases and again cut some of that the shipping costs that might be associated with bringing stuff in.
And David, before you leave this slide, you've got 2 questions in the chat. Could you give an example of a strike team, and can you comment on TDEs, which aren't in our list there?
TDEs.
Right. Temporary hires.
Oh, okay. Strike teams basically are set up as a small team that's going to come in. Very often will be a mixed team, people from different gaps that are going to come into a shelter or an area and do the initial response. I actually look at those as SOP up here. If I do have a village affected, I send in 3 to 5 people, different disciplines, so that we can do what is needed to immediately meet the needs, do DA, turn around, and do client assistance, and meet the needs of a small village or a small defined area. Temporary, you'll find more. I think I will go to, I think Louisiana is one where I recall in the last few years where we have paid people to do long-term casework over holidays, over a period of time. And very often when we got into, and this will probably be modified with our going into RC cares, but we have paid people to come in and to fill in where we don't have enough staff. Primarily, again, this, in my experience, has been more in the area of casework, where we do pay them a salary over a period of time.
Right. And so the question came up is, given the higher unemployment rates, would we consider using them? And I think the unemployment rate is not a factor we would bring into account for whether we'd hire temporary disaster employees or not. It's really based on the need of the operation. In general, they're only used on very long-term operations from my experience, but there could be other cases where we needed a particular skill and didn't have it or weren't able to deploy it from our resources. Chris, do you want to comment on that more?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, the duration of the event definitely has to do with it. I just want to add that, you know, consider, folks, that we're throwing all of these different options at you, because when you go in to build your service delivery plan and you're developing your IPT, these are all of the different factors that you want to think through when you're making a decision on which course to take, right? Do I want to hire temporary employees? Well, of course, because I get longer longevity, and I get a stable workforce and all of that, but it's very expensive. Do I want to go for event-based volunteers? Well, yes, I would love to, or fly in volunteers, yes, but I'm on a 6-month lava flow operation on the big island of Hawaii. And that might not be feasible, right? So just to say, that's why we're throwing all these different thoughts at you. And I'm loving the chat too, by the way. So
yeah,
thanks.
Lots of good comments in the chat.
Yeah.
One of the other ones that came up there is the DFSC. I forget exactly the count. I think there are 5, but I could be wrong in terms of disaster field supply centers. They are massive warehouses. The one I toured down in Hattiesburg was 1.5 million square feet, and the supplies were stacked 60 feet tall. They have a lot of supplies that they're ready to deploy to areas of need when a hurricane arrives or when a large wildfire. Here on the West Coast, our closest one is in Reno. There's another one in Dallas. There's a few more. I think Atlanta is another one scattered across the country. There's a map of those, and your logistics people know all about them, but they can generally get us supplies within about 24 hours. So they're really essential to our quick response. All right. I think we've knocked them out.
Develop initial planning assumptions based on the IIR, the DA's historical data. We are looking at, again, working a lot with partners. What is the area affected? How many homes are there? Power outages may increase our short-term housing, especially in that initial process. People aren't allowed back into the area, or if they are allowed back in, they really, their homes are not functional. In our area, it can just be too cold to send them home to a home with no heat. How many are affected, major destroyed, and then how many items of DES will you need? Are you looking at cleanup kits? Are we looking at modifying cleanup kits? Are we adding sifters for fires? Are we doing a kit for a flood where you're doing cleanup from water damage? The level of service will require how many Red Cross workers. A lot of that just goes back to working. Let us back up just a little bit. When we are looking at the service delivery plan, and when we are looking at a lot of work has been done to help us through this process. There is in the background a look at different requirements and different resources used on different levels of DRs. So when you are doing your initial plan, this enables you then to get an idea of just what you may need on that DR for that region based upon past experience. Carl keeps telling me someday he's going to let me see what that part of the service delivery plan looks like. But it does go back and actually uses some very real data that is associated with a specific response.
So what
And then
what David's referring to there's some additional tabs in the service delivery plan that are hidden, which have historical data on the last, about 10 years worth of disasters, so that it can quickly calculate for similar disasters of similar size, how to give you some reference points.
So that a lot of that is there. The other thing is I'd say, don't neglect the old volunteers that have been around a while, and just what have they seen, or what historically have they seen happen to similar disasters in the past? What resources do you need? Number of workers, of course, are going to generate number of cars, work locations, etc. Welcome to the initial planning tool. This is the first part of the service delivery plan. It does mean taking some, and this one is required within what, 96 hours?
Yes, that's general. Well, the initial planning tool, hopefully a little quicker than that, 72.
Yeah, normally I try to get it out within 48. In a level 2, you stand a good chance of getting it out within 24. But you have a good idea of how many are destroyed. Again, this is conjecture. It is information, the best information you have at the time you're creating this tool. So how many destroyed, how many major, and then how many minor. This is the same, you're going to see on the service delivery plan some blue, purple boxes above it that are basically going to be using what Carl and I just discussed about historical averages. So you can look and get an idea of what a minimum level 2 would be, a minimum level, or what ideally would happen, or what a major effect would be, to help balance things. If you have questions or you've got a gut feeling, take a look up there and see how it balances in. That goes from major, minor, affected, not including power outage, total DA, should get that, and then total fatalities. Fatalities do get addressed through ICCT as we go through here. The cost of fatalities, or the, not cost, but the assistance for fatalities is up to $1,000 now, and that would be included. Homes without power, that should be in there. Again, that's where it can be affected. You may, in the case of evacuations, have people who are cleared of an area, they don't have power, they can't go back in, they can affect your feeding and your sheltering, albeit for a briefer period of time. And then describe how you came to these conclusions. Where are you getting that information from? And this helps in the approval process. When you are meeting with the DDE, the DDD, or others who are looking over what your projections are. How long you're going to be there, how many people are affected. you again are projecting overnight stays. Again, you have the tools available to, and let me back up just a little bit on this one. This is not like the service delivery plan itself. You are not projecting of when the high period will be, when you will start releasing people. You're trying to look at the overall quantity. It does pay to pay attention to what is projected for the particular disaster you might be having. Local shelter support trailers, how many will be needed to come in? And then this is new, non-congregate hotel room nights required. How many people will you be putting up in a hotel, and what is that cost going to be per room? Shelter meals, what they'll cost non-shelter meals, and what is the projection of feeding, of at least looking. Again, it doesn't hurt to go and take a look at what's happened in the past. For a level 2, it shouldn't be too hard to come up with what you need. For a low level 3, not so bad. When you start getting up to a higher level 3, start looking closely at what's been done in the past. DES per items per household. Households to receive DES, put that in. And then again, go over here to the purple on the side, and this does look at what is suggested for this a particular level that you are looking at. And this goes back to the very top, and we don't show this in this plan, but we are actually entering the level of the disaster of a page back in the initial planning tool, so it automatically adjusts to that. Fatalities requiring assistance. Non-fatality cases, how many do we feel we're going to open? And then how many of those will require DCA? And in this case, they're using an average of 450, which happens to be the individual assistance amount that they would be getting in a level 4 and above. It doesn't hurt if you do know your area and you know it well. What is the average case cost for something in there for a level 2 or a level 3? You may want to adjust. Caseworkers, Red Cross workers to deploy. How many people do you feel you are going to have to bring in, and how many of those are going to be on TNM? How much? Again, this I would go to not only what's suggested here, but go to the COVID compendium, look at what is suggested for each one of those areas, because those have changed, and the numbers remaining back and working virtually will increase and not be on TNM. I believe, and it's not included here, what is it, $53 per virtual person if they need some DST to go with it. And that's to homework. Do you want to cover this one?
Sure, I can take it.
Yeah.
So I think the thing we wanted to emphasize today is if you think about what we covered in the earlier slides of what's going to be your approach to the operation, how many people are impacted, what's sort of the need. Once you get to the IPT, there's really not that many questions. This is the entirety of it. These 2 slides here with just a few boxes on who was impacted and then the questions on how you're going to do it. is pretty straightforward. You can generally fill this out in not a lot of time if you have the base information. And that's the harder thing to do than filling out the tool. So we wanted to cover that. So what we'd like you to do here in the exercise is first to download the service delivery plan, and you can find it on the Exchange by just searching for service delivery plan. We put the link in the chat earlier, so if you want to use the link there, or you can just do the search. We want you to read the instructions. The first tab is the instructions how to fill it out. We've got a video, which we'll also be providing you the link for, and I think we put it up as a pre-read for the next class, but we can double check on that. Which is some instructions from Alicia Cushman, who's in the National Finance team, and she walks through filling one out as far as a lecture. And so you can see that and walk through it, and that'll give you more questions for when we meet at the next one. What we'd like you to do before the next meeting is also just pick a previous DR that you worked on and just fill in the initial planning tool. Just try it, see what it comes up with for a budget, see what it comes up with for suggestions, and get yourself some experience with it. And then we'll answer more questions when we come back next time.
Yeah. One thing I would say about the service delivery plan, this is one document I would not put on your desktop. This is one where I would actually go and go to the Exchange, download it every time you start it. It changes. There have been additions now for COVID in the COVID environment, and it is goes through quite a bit of updating as time goes by. So just go back and get the freshest one you can get.
Right. It's standard practice to download it when the DR comes up, because the other thing, even if nothing in the fields and the display changes, the historical data gets added to as more events go by. So it gets better and tracks better. So that's the standard, is go there and to the Exchange and pick it up. We've addressed most of the questions as we've come up with. We've got a few minutes left. If somebody has some questions they want to ask now. Any questions we didn't address already in the chat?
Well, I would just encourage folks while we're waiting for questions, and feel free to interrupt me, but this is the opportunity in a safe environment when you've got the attention and like Dave and Carl said, please take some time this evening or tomorrow and fill out that form, because we can talk through whatever you were stuck on tomorrow. And try to answer any of the questions. It's much easier to do it now than when you got the wildfire breathing down your community, right? So
and okay. What is your quote, Chris, about the service delivery plan? And how well you've done it before we talk to you?
Which one? You can't do any worse than me. What? I don't know. It's the best guess. Some of us are better artists or something like that. Is that the one you're going? Yeah. Okay. It's an art, not a science, and you really are. I've seen a lot of conversation going about how it's a best guess, and it really is. You do it based on the best information that you have, and sometimes you have to. I hate to use the word make up, but you gotta make up something to move forward. 24 hours in, you don't know how many homes are destroyed. You don't know how many are under evacuation orders, for example. But you know that the organization is committing a significant amount of money, and we need to pick a number that we're going to resource this operation to. And then, the service delivery plan is also, like Carl said, to communicate why we're resourcing to such an event, and why we need to kind of set aside those funds to make sure we can respond to this thing.
All right, Chris, we have a question that's come in. Renton?
Sure. Bernice?
You're on. Bernice?
Yeah. So I was just going to comment that when Chris was on the Big Island, he literally like sat us all down and went on the dry erase board and literally like line by line by item, he walked us through it, and that's when it actually made sense. So it would have been great to try to do before trying to like go line by line and give a scenario.
I think we're going to have to mute you there.
Yeah, I muted you, Renee, because you've got quite a echo, but sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure. But actually, if you guys can all mute real quick. Okay, and so I think what she was describing there is we pulled up a whiteboard and we just started walking through all of these different questions and answers that basically that Carl and Dave have tried to lay out for us today. And we said, what's our best number we have for this issue, the number of meals, the number, right? And then you pick out how long do I want to plan for. And sometimes your bosses will tell you, you know, we want you to plan for 2 weeks. Give me your 2-week plan. Give me your 8-week plan, whatever it is. And then you know, you just do it.
Well, and some of them are easier than others. I mean, the last one I worked in Alaska with David, we got the estimates using the HAZUS model from FEMA, and it was within 5% of the actual damage, and we had it within the first 24 hours. So sometimes the data's there and it works. Thank goodness there weren't any big aftershocks to throw our plan off, but other times you don't know when the fire is going to stop burning.
But you can use that same incident and you think you're pretty much out of the woods. And people, in the case of an earthquake, are very, very reluctant to leave their homes. And so people start emerging a month later. And it's a much longer process to go through.
All right. So thank you. We've hit the end of our time for today, and we're all reconvening tomorrow. So I'm going to pull the conversation to a close here. And tomorrow we will actually fill in a plan together. So hopefully you'll have good experience. Any final comments before we close for the day? All right. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
We'll talk to you tomorrow.